Well, hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Fusion Studio for Entertainment and Engineering here at Purdue University, and to our first Friday sessions. I'm Rich Dione. I'm the co-director of the Fusion Studio. With me is my colleague, Dr. Mary Pilat. Mary.
Hi, Mary Pilat. Welcome, everyone.
We are also joined today by Kathy Skokan and Bob Klimek from Colorado School of Mines. They're going to talk to us today about their experiments and experiences with timing, latency, and live performance. As some of you may remember from some announcements earlier this year, this year's symposium on education and entertainment and engineering, for lots of reasons, not least of which the continuing saga of the COVID pandemic, we chose to partner with our colleagues at the Themed Experiences and Attractions Academic Society to present our symposium presentations at their symposium in Orlando in November. But Bob and Kathy are unable to attend that event. So we're really pleased to be able to have them present their work here with us today. I'm not going to say much more than that. I'm going to let them, they're what you're here to see. So I'm going to turn this over to Kathy and Bob, and we'll go from there. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
I thought I would start with describing our university. We are a public research university at the Colorado School of Mines. And I've got a slide of the picture of mines. That ought to be the next slide. There it is. There's our wonderful building. You see the little gold dome up there, which is very small. It's the leftover gold from the Colorado State Capitol. We have about 4,900 undergraduate students and about 1,500 graduate students. Our minority population is about 19%. Our female population is very high for an engineering school. We're at about 30%, which is way over the national average, and we're very proud of that. All of our degrees are engineering degrees. Historically, we have supported the natural resources industries with degrees in geology, geologic engineering, geophysical engineering, mining engineering, petroleum engineering, metallurgical engineering. Very recently, about 50 years or so ago, we added the more traditional engineering areas of civil, mechanical, electrical, and chemical engineering. We are considered a highly selective school. About 1 in 10 applicants actually end up enrolling. 15% of our population participates in the performing arts. We have a band, an orchestra, a jazz band, a choir, numerous ensembles, as well as classes in music theory, composition, history.
I think Kathy froze, so while she froze, I'll take the ball for a second. We're having a few problems at our end here at our school. So we have all these performing venues. What we found out with the engineers, that most of the engineers that come to our school also have in their background some form of performing arts. We also offer theater as well. But most of them are all staters, and they enjoy the fact that they are playing with musicians who are all engineers. So in our band, for example, they know the people next to them are engineers and not music students, which means they're all kind of in the same place time-wise as they achieve their degree in music. Could you pull the next slide, please? We have a recording studio. We were very successful a few years back to record a ethnomusic for the Smithsonian Institute. And when we did this, that institute put the recording into the National Public Radio system, and it achieved the recording of the month for National Public Radio. We're also lucky in our department. We have 2 Grammy winners, and we also have a person who has placed for a Grammy. So in our small department, we have very high student level of performers and musicians, and we also have a good faculty as well. If we can pull the slide then. Did Kathy come back yet? No. I'm going to start with the concept of latency. And by latency, I mean this. We all are familiar with latency as it's presented to us during COVID as online latency, something to do with the fact that the signal and the information is not getting to one side and coming back fast enough for us to, for example, maybe perform together, have the ability to play together, have the ability to be in the same place at the same time. And I'm going to use this performance model from the Worlds of Music by Jeff Todd Titan and change it a little bit. I'm going to call it the perfect performance model. Now, this is the same model for whatever performing art model you put into the picture. So what it is think of a still pond, and in the still pond, you drop a pebble. And the pebble basically concentric circles move out from the initial impact of the pebble. And what happens also is there's a ripple back as well. And what the center is the music itself or the art itself. So the composer or the playwright lives there, and the music itself, which was created for this event, is at the center. That starts the concentric circles. And then the affect moves out from those circles and goes to the performers, who basically take that music and take it to a situation where they basically interpret it for an audience. And then the audience hears it. They respond to it by applause or smiles or throwing tomatoes at the stage, I guess. And this all takes place in an actual moment, in an actual acoustical space as well. Each one of these concentric rings has a latency problem to it. So we can pop to the next slide. This is the same concept of concentric circles, except it's named a little differently and it's more in depth. The music or the art that's being performed, to consider it a real live performance in the ideal world, it must be an effective experience. It must have the effect of creating a ring going to the performers and the performance time itself. And the performance, which takes place through the musicians or the actors, whatever is the performance, must create a ripple or effect to the community. Now, the community basically listens to it, and they either support or don't support what's going on in the performance. If you go to a high opera, we'll say someplace in Europe, your expectation for being present is dressing well, knowing when to applaud, when to stand, when to sit. But if you go to a South African band performance, in a lot of cases, the expectation is some of you will rush the stage and take over the microphones and start participating with the musicians. And so that's a given. And so the community dresses itself, does certain rituals to let the performers know they are there. And this all takes place in a memory historical moment. And what that means basically is there's a moment created by the performers and by the audience that is remembered and plays into how the community in general will grow and move forward and have expectations for the next performance. And between these circles, there are a thing called agreements. Now, what I mean by agreements is that everybody agrees that if you perform well, somehow you'll applaud or something to let the performers know that was well. It's agreed upon that you dress a certain way, you act a certain way, and these agreed upon things happen in real time. They happen in a real moment, and that's the latency means immediate. And that's the problem we've been fighting with during COVID. We need to remember two things. Okay, I want to give this idea. If you think about they're Mexican cliff divers that dive off into water. They stand at the top, look at the bottom, and they trust that the water will buoy them up, will support them, and then they dive off. Okay. It's the same thing with the performers. They look out into the audience, they begin performing, and they trust that there will be agreement and there'll be an affect between them, the historical moment, and also the audience. So I'm going to stop at this point and see if Kathy's been able to rejoin us or not.
I'm back on.
Okay,
Yes.
we'll need the next slide then. Thank you.
Okay, yes, yes. I'm not sure what happened, but, you know, thank you, Internet. I'm not sure that you saw that they offer a minor in music technology. And latency is going to be such a wonderful topic because right now I can hear a delay, a considerable delay. And so latency, we're going to define as a delay between the source, my voice, and my ear. And right now, for me, for some reason, it's about 250 milliseconds. I can hear a definite delay.
Catherine, I was actually going to interrupt and say, if you turn the speaker off on your phone or turn the volume down on your phone, that should eliminate that echo.
I did try to do that already. And I just want to leave my phone on so that I have a backup, an immediate backup. So I'm going to put my phone down under a pillow. Maybe that will help. There. Okay. I can still hear it a little bit, but that's okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about the engineering of the problems of latency. Sound travels, and we're going to use English units because English units are convenient for us and we recognize them quickly. Sound travels at about a foot a millisecond, and light travels about a foot a nanosecond. So 10 to the 6th or 1,000,000 times faster. And this becomes very important because we can see faster than we can hear. And so one way that we stay together when we are performing is that we see and we respond to visual cues rather than audio cues more rapidly. This can become an issue, the idea of sound traveling at 1 foot per second on a performing stage. Let's look at an orchestra, for example. The first violin in the front is about 30 feet from the timpani in the back of the orchestra. And that means that there's about a 30 millisecond change. Our brains have decided that those are simultaneous sounds. We are able to interpolate them. And so when we listen to a symphony orchestra, we don't hear that echo that should be occurring. Our ear can hear 2 pings that are 10 milliseconds apart. We can hear them that fast, but we have chosen to listen, and we can do just fine with a good 40 milliseconds. By the time we get to 250 milliseconds, which is what I can hear under this pillow over here, we really do hear an echo. So that's one issue, is distance, and there's nothing we can do about distance other than our brain has decided to interpolate things. Instruments have a different ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release. I'm a violinist and a bassoon player, and as a violinist, as soon as I begin moving the bow, I have an attack. I have a sound that emanates from my violin. However, with a bassoon, I have to have a reed that vibrates, and then the air goes from that vibrating reed down through a very long tube and back up through a very long tube. And so there's an actual delay in the attack. And so musical instruments have that as just part of life. With the advent of things like Zoom, what happens is that we have a microphone, and I'm about a foot right now from the microphone on my computer. So that is about a millisecond. We can change that by wearing headphones and having a microphone very close. So we can make those closer, but from our voice or our instrument to the microphone, the signal then goes into a network, and there's an A to D conversion, an analog signal to a digital signal conversion. The data is then wrapped in packets, and the packets are then sent over the internet, which, as we all well know, as I just found out, are dependent on our local servers, right? And then when we get to the next person, all of you, we have to undo that process. And that process can be as much as 250 milliseconds for Zoom. That's acceptable oftentimes for voice transmission, but if we're trying to do simultaneous music, singing or playing with an accompaniment, it is unacceptable. It is way too long. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Bob.
So we'll pull to another slide here. And what I want to go back to real quick is the perfect performance model. Please keep those concentric circles in mind. Here's a quote: "Music is not something given, but something which rests on the agreement among composer, performer, and listener." And again, that quote works for no matter what performing art you're talking about. What you want to add to this is that the composer, the creator of the art being performed, is also part of that. In real time, to have a real time latency free, which doesn't really exist, we're going to find out, the music has to create and affect a power to move the audience, to move the historical moment, so it moves back and washes back over the performers and the composer or the writer again. Now, what you're seeing here is the theater at Ephesus. St. Paul, who was at Ephesus for a while, in 1 Corinthians made the comment, if you do not have love, your voices will sound like an empty gong. And a lot of people have wondered what that means. If you look at this picture, there are wooden doors in the lower tier of the stage. Those are hollow doors, and the speakers would come out, and the actors would talk against those doors to reflect the sound back up into the stands. However, that still didn't work that well. The soldiers who were guarding the event were told to hang their shields behind the audience on the highest tier. What happened was, if you've ever seen those echo chambers where you stand back to back and you whisper and the person behind you can hear the whisper and very strongly, that's what happened here. What Paul was talking about is you could sit in the theater and you would hear those gongs resonating with the sound from those doors. Okay, it didn't sound like a real voice or a real full voice. It sounded empty. But by agreement of the audience, it was acceptable that you were seeing the action, you're seeing the movement, and you could hear the words. And so we just accepted that latency. Now we're going to go to the 17th century next. And in the 17th century, we'll pull to the next slide, we're going to talk about the fact that they have this thing called broken concerts or whole consorts. What that meant was the instruments involved. If you had a group of instruments that were of the same build but different sizes, say the violin family, the violins to the violas to the cellos to the double basses, or the flute family, which would be the same, that was called a whole consort, okay? Broken concert meant dissimilar instruments, and in the early Baroque, there were a lot of instruments that were very odd in how they sounded. And for example, one was called the racket. It looked like a coffee can with a straw on top. Now, the instrument was called the racket because it sounded exactly as its name suggests. There was no worrying about attack, decay, sustain, or release because it just started and stopped. It was like, try to play a flute with the bagpipe together. The bagpipe eventually starts the flutes a little bit ahead. They have to kind of compromise. Well, the way the compromise worked on these broken consorts is they would basically eventually have to figure out a way to keep people together, because our theory system, the common practice theory system of 1600 to 1750, that we used in Western music relied on the fact of instruments all starting and stopping at the same time. Now, I have two pictures of Lili, and I'm suggesting the first one's before the concert, and the second one is after the concert. Here's what happened. The way they started keeping these mixed groups together was by pounding a stick with a metal point at the bottom on the floor or on a hollow conducting box. Now, by doing this, everybody could hear the rhythm and they could stay together better. The agreement was the audience ignored the loud pounding sound and just listened to the music around it. That made it a live performance for them. Lully, unfortunately, pounded through his foot at one of these performances, did not take care of it, and died shortly afterwards of gangrene. So that is proof as a musician that music can be dangerous to your health. If we pull the next slide up, this is St. Mark's in Venice. This is a very famous cathedral for sound and acoustics. Gabriel's, and especially Giovanni we'll talk about, discovered a lot of things about the geography of sound here and the geography of latency. As you see in this picture, if you look at the far top left, there's a balcony up there, and there's one to the right side as well. And they're all half domed. There are also, these go throughout the whole church. The church is in a cruciform pattern. So you can go down the middle and look to the right and left, and it goes, there's two arms there, and then all the way to the end. Well, Gabriel discovered a couple important things. He discovered that sometimes he would mix a brass group with his choir, and the problem was they were too loud. So what he would do is put the brass group someplace else in the cathedral and put the singers closer to the people listening. And then they would all just kind of play together, and it just worked. The other thing is, in these big cathedrals, you have kind of the terrible, magnificent sound of all the reverb going on. And the interesting thing about that is we just accepted that as the sound that happens in big cathedrals, okay? This happens with pipe organs, by the way. This church does not have the big pipe organ in it, but if you went to Notre Dame in Paris, you'd find out the delay there is significant. Organists would play listening to the sound, not with the notes they're playing in their hands. They just, by agreement, knew to do that. They also, if they're playing with a choir, the pipes could be located someplace else in this gigantic room, and they would just know that the blend would happen in all the buildup of sound in the cathedral, and it was accepted by the choir to kind of follow what the organist was directing at the time, and the organist is thinking ahead because they've already played the music that the choir hasn't gotten to yet. So a lot of agreement is going on to make this a performance in real time. And so we allowed that to happen. But going back to Gabriele, he would move the musicians around, and so move, again, like I said, the brass group to the back, the choir to the front, and he discovered loud and soft. Now, someone would say, why didn't he just tell the brass group to be quiet? Well, if anybody out there works with a marching band, that may not always work. Anyway, he discovers loud and soft, and they discover by placing people around in different areas, you can change the latency. If you dress the men in wool and they sing near the floor, off the floor rather than heightened up, they will sound lower. If you dress the women in silks and you place them a little bit higher up than the men, they will reverberate through a group. So the whole concept of latency was still the sound arriving at the ear, but people are agreeing on it. One of the problems we started having in Western music very early on was Aaron Copland suggested this. What was going on was we were looking for the magnificent, terrible sound. If you play an organ in one of these cathedrals, you get this great buildup. You hear the walls rattle, and that's what you're listening for. Play the same place in a dry room, and it doesn't sound the same. And you can also hear all the parts. The other thing in the Baroque period they did is they played slower and lower than we do today. And that was a way to take care of some of the latency problems they had. Going back to Copland, Copland said what was happening at this period was, and still going on today, this problem with aesthetic. The Grand Canyon is great. Beethoven's Ninth is great. Greater is Beethoven's Ninth played in the Grand Canyon. Now, if we can go to the next slide, this is Bayreuth. This is the theater that was built for Wagner to perform his operas, especially the Ring trilogy, because it took a very long time. And there was a tremendous amount of staging. And the pulleys that were being used were wooden. They weren't nylon. They weren't quiet. And so many things were going on the stage at the same time. They had battleships coming across the stage actually being floated. They had the orchestra sometimes put on Ferris wheels that were decorated to look like clouds, which would be moving in the background. This all was loud, and the people had a hard time, obviously, hearing the actors and the musicians who were below stage at times. But it was agreed that to have a real performance at this time, the audience agreed that we will look at the beautiful machinery, listen to the pulleys and the wheels, and appreciate what Wagner might have sounded like had we heard it that day. Actually, Mark Twain at one point, knowing this, made the comment that Wagner is much better than he sounds. If we can pull the next one up here. What's going to happen eventually is conductors will, this is Beethoven, start conducting with a baton because they didn't want to damage their health anymore. And the orchestras, like Kathy alluded to already, had the problems of blending and covering over their attacks, which were slightly different. A piccolo is going to sound a lot faster than a tuba does. And the French horns were being used basically to cover over everybody's ADSR differences. So if we can pop up the next slide, okay. Room reverberation, acoustics, audiences talking during performances. I know this is kind of new to us because we go to a performance and listen to Beethoven's Ninth, and you're thinking, well, it's got to be quiet. Not in these times. This was a common meeting place for people, and they would talk. Sometimes snacks were being sold on the main floor, but think of it more like a tame baseball game. So this was all accepted as part of the performance. And we began to know that this was what a performance sounded like. And by agreement of all those circles, this was a real-time live performance filled with latency every place. And now we come to another possibility, and there's no slide for this, we'll hold. EDM music, earbud music, and something I'm going to call modern church music, okay? Electric dance music, maybe somebody on stage operating electronic equipment. Performers not really there. The audience may or may not be reacting to what they're doing on the stage. The creator's not really there either. Earbuds, you're exercising, you're running, listening to the earbuds. Performer's not there. The composer's not there. There's no audience there. There's no real moment it's happening to during, except where you're running at, or if you're at a weightlifting situation, the machine you're using for weightlifting, okay? The EDM music is basically called live PA music, okay? The other thing is, a few years back, in some churches, they got the idea that they could save money by getting rid of the musicians and just buying a bunch of electronic organs that could play themselves. So one musician would go, and the Phoenix did this for a few years back in the 90s. They would have one musician go around to 5 different churches, play what was going to go on Sunday, and then they were done for the weekend. They could take off. On Sundays, someone would push a button, people would sing along with the button. No performer there, nobody, in a sense, you're moving along with something that's not real, okay? So the performance model is gone, not there at all, okay? I was once, a long time ago, when Disney had the, I don't know if they still have it, they had the Country Bear Jamboree. After it was over with, it was all robotics, okay, and canned music. After it was all over, the stage was closing and everybody broke out in applause. And somebody in a stage voice said, there's nobody here. And the applause stopped. And that was a realization that basically the perfect performance model was missing. And the last thing I offer as proof of the perfect performance model moving away from us is a magician I know. His name is Romanoff, and he performs in the Midwest. And he once came out on stage, pulled 2 bouquets of flowers, 4 ducks, 5 chickens, and 5 rabbits out of nothing and got no applause. And he rationalized that this is what was going on. People no longer know how to react because we've been put into this not a perfect performance model so much. People are basically consumers, but they no longer react. Their place as being in agreement of what's going on is no longer there, and they no longer are having an effective experience. It's just being poured over them. So the question we have as we move forth, and Kathy takes over at this point, is the perfect performance model slowly disintegrating a good thing or a bad thing? Or do we need to work with it and look for some kind of innovation to bring it back stronger? Or has performance changed in such a way that it doesn't matter anymore? So, Kathy, it's yours.
Okay. I have a couple of examples, and we need to move on to the next slide. Okay, so that's one example. The next example is something that many of us during COVID began to experience, and that is a virtual choir. We know that we can do moderately well with some very sophisticated software programs like SoundJack and Jam Kazam and ArtMash and the like to reduce the latency problem. And we have been able, with very expensive equipment, to do simultaneous musical performances at less than 500 miles apart because of networking problems. But with these fancy software and very, very, very expensive equipment, we've had a performance from New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio simultaneous, but that's not what we could do all the time. And so often we had these virtual choirs where each performer would record to a click track and send, and an engineer would then edit all of the files and make it look like an ensemble making a performance together. This multi-track recording is a good experience for a recording studio, but when we're looking at this over a large number of people in a very large distance, it's not quite as satisfying. But these approximated during COVID a live performance. We participated in the, our Minds band did, in the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Ireland in 2017. In 2020, there was no St. Patrick's Day Parade, compliments of COVID. And so the bands that had participated in the parade in the past, about 100 different groups, were asked to record Danny Boy and send it in. And at the U2 studio, an engineer put together a virtual choir. And so we've got the clip of Danny Boy. So there it was, the virtual choir. And our uniforms haven't changed for about 100 years. Our students are still wearing flannel shirts, blue jeans, and hard hats. And so I hope you saw lots of them. The advantage of this virtual choir, so to say, is that we could have people from throughout the world perform together. If someone didn't play very well, we could mute them. The engineer could mute them, but their picture would still be there. And so everybody got credit and everybody was happy.
A few years back, I did a performance with an orchestra of 100 musicians and 100 choir people in Sun Devil Stadium. And I can tell you what the people heard was the whole unit together, when in reality was happening was the fact that there was a choir of 8 and there was a choir of 16 musicians, and they were being amplified through the sound system. And in order to make it seem that there were more there was a general house noise that was mixed in. So the engineer had a lot to do with being part of the performance and being a performer here. So I'm going to bring some stuff to a real close here very quickly by just stating some questions. One, Kathy and I didn't solve anything, and we knew when we started this we wouldn't. Two, what we wanted to do is let people know that there's latency has been going on, and musicians and performers have been solving it for centuries in many different ways. And sometimes latency leads to, like in the Gabrielli case, discovering loud and soft. Some solutions for our latency, especially the online latency. Number one, the composers in the past have solved some of the acoustical latency problems they have by writing different styles so that parts don't have to be together immediately, okay? So we, in our common practice period in the Western music theory system, depend upon everything hitting at the same time. We could look outside our theory system into other ethno-theory systems from other countries and other groups and see how we could use some of their ways of doing music, rather than just having a vertical situation where all our notes come together. Maybe we could have a more horizontal music, okay? The other thing that's been tried is to have one live musician and everybody else being an online musician. And it covers over the latency. A lot of Christian churches are doing this, where they're broadcasting from a main church to satellite churches, and they have live musicians in those areas to cover over the problems between what's being broadcast and what's being heard by the audience, okay? The other thing in that, which you heard real quickly in the example we gave of the stock show, the lighting people were working with us to cover over the problem. The speakers was working, the narrator was working with us because of the big echo to cover over the problem. Also, there was a lot of reverb in this situation. And so that again covered over the problem of things starting and stopping and being timed very specifically. The other solution is new electronic gear, new programs of some sort, and everybody classing up the gear they're using. Because one of the biggest problems we have with the online latency right now is not everybody has the same speeds and processing speeds. Not everybody has the same microphones or the same speakers, and that changes this. But instead of this being a problem, I think COVID showed us we can grow in another direction. And that's the positive thing. And by looking at the way other basically traditions and other kinds of music, non-Western, occur, we might find some answers of blending our Western style with their styles more, so we can not only solve the latency problem, but we can end up solving some situations of where our music can go in the future. Just like Gabrielli discovered loud and soft, there's some new things to be discovered out there. So at this point, I'm not sure if there's questions, but I'll turn this back over to Rich and Mary.
Well, thank you both. I found so much of that fascinating. And as I threw up in the chat, I am particularly fond of the idea that we might think outside the box, and instead of trying to technologically eliminate latency, let our work adapt to it. As you pointed out, that's where some of the maybe more interesting movements and changes in all of our art have happened, is when we try to solve something that we can't solve. I haven't seen any questions yet pop up in the chat. This is an opportunity and a time to do that. If you all have questions, those of you who've been attending, thank you so much for being here. I don't want to call anybody out, but I know most of the folks who are here. So I know that there are some folks that I could call on to say, I know you deal with latency all the time. So I'd be curious to hear what some of your thoughts are, or responses to any of this, if you have any.
Well, we can't get by the science. I mean, That's it.
Right. We can't make sound move faster than it moves.
That's right.
We can't make electrons move faster than they move. So
Not this week.
well, it doesn't look. Go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, it really looks like an interesting world now that we've gotten over some of the situation with COVID. I know a lot of excited performers, musicians that are thinking, this is really a way, it's not the same anymore. Someone said it's like if tomorrow a alien spaceship landed in the middle of Times Square, all bets are off. Nothing's the same anymore. That doesn't mean all hope is off. It just means the way we were doing it now becomes history.
Sure, absolutely. So Tom has thrown up in the chat, Tom Gorman, whom I know from University of Coventry. I think that's the right name for where Tom is at. He does a lot of work with distance performances and casts in 2 different areas with these big teleconferencing setups. We did one with him years ago. It's really amazing work, and that's definitely something Latency is part of his world. He mentioned that he enjoyed listening to this. I have to imagine that at some point, Bob and Kathy, you all might have lots to chat with Tom about specifically.
Love to.
Because this is his bread and butter in some ways.
I would love to.
So perhaps we'll try to connect you all together.
Yeah. The other thing is we really we need to start thinking of engineers as being artists and not seeing they're just sitting. And I'm actually talking about all forms of engineering as art forms, because especially in this case, you can prove that the engineer has to think using an artistic sense to make a real-time event happen, to affect people. They're doing their engineering to affect people. That's different.
Well, and the artist too needs to be an engineer. Isn't that why we're all together? Isn't it wonderful?
Sure. Mary, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that, the whole notion of user-centered design really takes on a new frame in this setting, this context that you've created. And this notion of agreement, really, as we're designing for our users, we're really trying to establish some sort of agreement with the end user. But you've unpacked it in this fascinating way and added historical context that really has my brain kind of buzzing. I don't think I'll be normal all afternoon thinking about
Oh, good.
the notion of agreement, right? And it's how frightening it is on some level that we've become so numb, right? That we've given away our ability to respond to sessions. So that was fascinating to me.
Yeah,
the notion that we can sort of pluck out this assumption that we've all agreed to without thinking about it, that everything has to be perfectly in sync. And that even that assumption belies the fact that not everything has been perfectly in sync. We've made agreements tacitly that there are latencies that we accept that we don't even really recognize, and acknowledging that can open us up to different latencies. Sorry, Bob, I interrupted you.
No, I was agreeing with you. I was working with a Hispanic group in San Antonio a few years back, and we went to start. There were 70 of them, and I was kind of talking them through some things. And we went to start, and they all started, and you can imagine they all started, and we all stopped. But it was like a train that's 100 cars long, and you go stop. It's a long skid before you're at full stop. I asked them if they bothered them, and they said no, because it was the fact we were participating. We're obsessed in certain cultures with beginnings and endings, and they're more the amplitude of them all being together. The idea that group could create that sound, the beginning and end didn't matter, which led me to one other experience I had where the musician said, when I light the candle in the room, that's when the performance starts. And they were playing before the candle was lit. And he was determining when the performance was starting and giving a visual indication. So we really, again, if you think about the fact that music, just using that art form, if you wanted to know all the capabilities of the ear, you'd have to hear every possibility of music in the world. And just like you might not like tasting some of the foods in the world, you might not like hearing some of that music because it can't make sense to you. we have to agree there are some things that people in the world can hear that we can't. And all of a sudden you realize how large the possibility is for a future.
That's a great way to sort of put a pin in this as we reach 1 o'clock. Thank you both for this. This was fantastic. Thank you, everybody who's attended today. I hope you got a lot out of this. As a former sound designer, I don't get to play in that world very much. I find all of this really fascinating. And, you know, there are lots of conversations to be had about this, even in terms of sourcing sound effects on stage that are, you know, about latency and why does it matter and doesn't matter. So thank you both for this. Mary, do you have anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
Nothing to add, but thank you to everyone who joined us today, knowing that we're going into the holiday week. Thanks so much for participating. We absolutely appreciate your support.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Rich and Mary, for having us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Our pleasure.
Yes. And if anybody wants to reach out to either of us, please do.
All right. And those of you who are attending, we plan to have in our August 1st Friday, the winners of the 2021 Stage Machine Design Competition. We're going to pepper them with questions, and we hope you will come and pepper them with questions too. Thank you all very much. Have fantastic days. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.